Hello, everybody, and welcome to my presentation on the impact of the Ketchikan Rural Designation on the population of Southeast Alaska. Ketchikan is now considered a rural community, which brings both challenges and benefits for the population of Ketchikan as well as the surrounding southeast area. One of the biggest changes is that people will now have access to federal benefits like subsistence hunting and fishing rights in Ketchikan, which are very important to their communities and their culture. In this presentation, I'll be going over how this new designation will impact the local population, the economy, and the cultural practices in Ketchikan. So why did I choose this topic? I was actually at the board meetings when the decision to designate Ketchikan as a rural community was made. I wanted to dig deeper into the long-term consequences, how this decision will affect the economy, the local population, and even the environment in Ketchikan and the surrounding areas. So what does rural designation mean? To start, Ketchikan is now considered a rural area, which means that the people who live in Ketchikan will now have access to subsistence rights that they didn't have before. These rights are very important because hunting and fishing are essential to many Alaska Native cultures and provide a lot more than food, but also cultural significance. This change doesn't just affect the rights to hunt and fish. It will also impact how resources are managed, where people move, and the general flow of the communities. So let's get some historical context. Historically, rural areas in Alaska have always had special privileges, like access to subsistence rights and more federal funding for things like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. As Stephen Haycox mentions in his book, Alaska, an American Colony, quote, "The impact of federal policies on rural Alaska communities has been profound, shaping both their economic and social fabric," unquote. This gives us some background on how this shift will have long-term impacts on the community. Ketchikan's shift is a great example of how the government treats rural and urban communities very differently. Urban areas like Ketchikan don't have access to these same benefits, which is why this change is so important. Subsistence rights and resource management. For Alaska Native communities, subsistence hunting and fishing aren't just about survival. They're vital to our culture and our traditions. Now with this new rural designation, Ketchikan residents will be able to access the same resources which was previously restricted for urban residents. However, this new access comes with the potential risk for overharvesting. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game warns that people relying on these resources could lead to overfishing and hunting, which would harm the environment and the economy in the long term. Economic impact and federal funding. Rural areas also tend to get way more federal funding, especially for public services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. This also means that Ketchikan will probably receive more federal money to improve things like roads, schools, and healthcare. But this could also create competition. As Stephen Colt points out, quote, "Rural policies often bring with the recollection of federal funds, particularly in areas like healthcare and education," unquote. Ketchikan might not be the only community pushing for these resources. Migration and population shifts. With this new designation, we could see more people moving to Ketchikan. Since they now have access to subsistence rights and better services, it may be a more attractive place to live. As Lillian Naves points out, this could really shift the population dynamics in Ketchikan, More people moving into the area could put pressure on local resources and housing, like housing and healthcare. The downside to this migration is that it could create overcrowding, which, with more people needing housing, schools, and healthcare services, which would make things harder for everybody. Cultural impacts and community tensions. As I mentioned earlier, subsistence activities are deeply tied to Alaska Native cultures and are not just about survival. They're about maintaining a way of life and connecting with family and tradition. But with more people coming in to access these resources, this could lead to tensions. Long-term residents might find themselves competing with newcomers for fish, game, and land. Sorry, I'm about to butcher this name. As Phineas Riordan points out, with more people familiarizing their access to subsistence resources, it could change the way communities work, especially if resources become scarce. This will definitely become something to watch. Political and environmental concerns. Politically, Ketchikan's rule designation might inspire other communities like Juneau in southeast Alaska to push for similar designations. This could change how federal resources are allocated across the region. As more people move to Ketchikan, the pressure on local ecosystems will only increase. We could see overfishing and overhunting if resource management doesn't keep up with demand. Community adaptation and resilience. However, Southeast has a strong history of adapting. Local communities have found ways to balance their traditional ways of life with modern needs. Ketchikan has the chance to do the same. This rural status opens the door for economic growth, but it also means that the community will need to work hard to protect its resources and manage this growth responsibly. Sustainability is the key. Local leaders must focus on balancing growth with the preservation of resources so future generations can thrive in Southeast Alaska. Conclusions. To sum up, Ketchikan's rule designation has its benefits like access to subsistence rights, but it also brings challenges. More people and more demand for resources will definitely impact the community. While access to subsistence rights is a huge benefit, it will also create competition for resources, which might lead to tensions between long-term residents and newcomers. The increased federal funding could help Ketchikan, but other nearby communities might feel left out and compete for these resources. Ultimately, Ketchikan's future will depend on how well the community adapts to these changes and in how it manages to balance growth, sustainability, and cultural preservation. Thank you. These are my references if you'd like to pause and take a screenshot. Thank you.